on Plugged In.
And we're fighting a war on drugs. They're bringing in drugs. They're bringing in lots of bad people.
The $1 trillion war on drugs to stop heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine abuse. But is it working?
A lot of people think it's cool, and yeah, I feel like it's so easy to obtain.
Despite the best efforts of law enforcement, a UN study shows drug use is on the rise. From cannabis to legal prescription drugs and synthetic opiates that have killed thousands around the world. Plugged In looks at the global drug trade, America's other war. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. 48 years and counting. That is how long the United States has been waging a losing war against illegal drugs.
This is crack cocaine. It's turning our cities into battle zones.
Stopping the manufacture and sale of methamphetamines remains one of our highest priorities.
America's public enemy number one is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values. They're killing our children.
We need to have an approach that emphasizes prevention, treatment, a public health model for reducing drug use in our country.
Opioid overdose deaths have nearly quadrupled since 1999. This is a total epidemic.
Drugs. The word used to mean medication, something used to cure, treat, or prevent illness. But today, it's a word that carries negative baggage. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, drug meant the devil weed, marijuana, a drug many believe was a gateway to hard drugs like heroin and LSD. The 80s brought us crack cocaine, and the 90s and 2000s witnessed the rise of ecstasy and meth labs. Today, synthetic opiates are the latest scourge. They're chemically designed cocktails that have killed thousands in the United States and around the globe. That's why the war on drugs is as relevant today as it was in the 1970s when U.S. President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one. But is the United States winning the war on drugs? Plugged In's Gil Kerlikowske has more.
There are drug busts and there are drug busts, like this one in June at the Port of Philadelphia, one of the largest drug seizures in U.S. history. Nearly 18 metric tons of cocaine, with an estimated street value of over $1 billion. European authorities made a similar bust in August at the Port of Hamburg, a large cache of sports bags containing 4,200 packages of cocaine worth $1.1 billion. Drug monitoring agencies say cocaine production has risen sharply since 2014. So is its potency.
Just to highlight that the purity of cocaine has reached its highest level over the last decade. So we see an impressive amount of cocaine being seized.
While the bulk of drugs seized in the U.S. have occurred at sea and at other ports of entry, President Donald Trump has tasked Customs and Border Patrol agents along the southern border with Mexico to be the front line on the war on drugs.
They're warriors. We're fighting a war, and we're fighting a war on drugs. They're bringing in drugs. They're bringing in lots of bad people. We're getting to hell. We're stopping it. So we're going to be taking some very tough actions.
But tough action has yet to make a dent on demand. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime says the number of people who use illegal drugs is 30% higher than it was 10 years ago. In the U.S., cocaine use has increased in the past year among women, people between the ages of 18 and 25, those over 50, African Americans, and people in lower-income families. That has led to more drug arrests, one every 25 seconds, according to the FBI. Some drug enforcement agents believe it may be time for a different approach.
We really need to focus on the prevention efforts.
The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime says worldwide, about 271 million people used drugs in the past year. Of those, 35 million suffer from drug use disorders, such as addiction. But only 1 in 7 will receive treatment. More urgent still is the rise of synthetic opioids, which are often mixed with other drugs, resulting in more than 47,000 opioid-related deaths in 2017 in the United States. Gil Kerlikowske, VOA News, Washington.
The United States has been fighting the war on drugs for nearly 5 decades. The fight began in 1971 when President Nixon and has continued all the way to the present time to the current U.S. President, Donald Trump. The cost is giant, estimated at more than $1 trillion. Many wonder whether efforts to reduce drug consumption are working. My next guest says he does not like the term war on drugs, and he should know. Gil Kerlikowske is a former commissioner for the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. He was also the U.S. drug czar when he headed the Office of National Drug Control Policy under President Obama. He has served as police chief of Seattle and led the U.S. delegation for the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs. He joins us from Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. Welcome to Drugged In, sir. Plugged in, I should say, not drugged in, plugged in. That was a Freudian slip, and how apt. First tell me, why don't you like the term war on drugs?
Well, we looked at it for a long time as a criminal justice and a policing issue. And from the reporting that you just did, it's pretty obvious that that's not the answer. What we see, and what I think a lot of people see as a potential answer and improvement, is this combination of public health and criminal justice working in tandem to prevent and to treat people, but also to go after the traffickers and to go after the money.
All right, I assume you agree with me that there is a legitimate use for drugs. We don't want people to be in pain, but we're talking about where it becomes illegitimate, meaning that there's no medical necessity and it creates all sorts of problems for, for the person taking them as well as the community and all the, problems that arise with it. So do you agree with me that there's a legitimate use?
Oh, absolutely. And there are a number of countries that have almost banned these kind of painkillers. And if you think of people in palliative care or end-of-life care, cancer treatment, etc., I mean, these drugs can make their end of life much more tolerable.
All right. Putting aside the legitimate use for to take care of pain, what's the root cause of the other use of it? Is there any way to identify that?
So it's a really complicated issue with opioids. In particular, the Commission on Hospital Accreditation wanted doctors to make sure that patients left pain-free, and so the easiest way to do that was to write prescriptions. The large pharmaceutical companies essentially said, look, you can write as many of these prescriptions as you want and you don't have to worry about addiction. When you have that combination of these two kind of falsehoods, it has really led to a crisis and to an epidemic.
All right, setting aside the issue of the term war on drugs, which you don't like, is the U.S. winning this war? I mean, is it safe to say that we're not?
Well, I think that one thing that we should look at is that we need to push our borders out. If we try to contain drugs coming in just merely at our U.S. mail facilities or along the border, particularly the southwest border, that's why we need to be much more engaged in diplomacy and working, whether it's in Colombia, whether it's in Afghanistan or other countries that end up producing these kinds of drugs. The other thing that's lacking, of course, is really a very empirically based prevention program that young people can get early on throughout their time in school.
But President Trump has tweeted that China is largely responsible for the fentanyl crisis here in the country. China, the chief drug enforcement officer in China has just said that's not true. It's not China. Is China a culprit involved in this, number one? And number two, what, if anything, can we do to stop that with China?
So China is a culprit. They're not the only culprit. And it doesn't mean that just fentanyl comes from China. The precursor chemicals that can be sent to, for example, Mexico to make fentanyl oftentimes can come from China. But if you go back just a couple years ago, we were very concerned in this country about synthetic marijuana, these kind of grass clippings that were sold in gas stations that had been sprayed with chemicals. A lot of those precursors and chemicals came from China. But by working with China and through diplomatic relations, China really ended that. And today you never hear really anybody complaining about synthetic marijuana, and that was such a scourge a few years ago. So diplomacy and cooperation, particularly among law enforcement agencies in different countries, and working with the UNODC makes a lot of sense.
What did we do for pain before fentanyl showed up on the scene? I think we use drugs like morphine, but fentanyl is almost 100 times more potent.
We've seen a lot of different techniques and drugs, but if you look at the training that doctors get in medical school, they get almost zero amount of time either about pain management or addiction. And that's different here in Massachusetts, where it's required that at least 3 days in medical school that you actually get that kind of information. But there are a lot of other ways to treat pain, of course, that are being looked at: acupuncture, physical therapy, etc. But you know, we're a nation raised on pills, and when we go to the doctor and we have a problem, we want a prescription and we want to walk away and have that solved. We don't want to have to go to physical therapy for the next 6 weeks or acupuncture every other week, etc. So we really need to look at, you know, maybe there are better ways to address this. And by the way, opioid painkillers are not the best way to address long-term pain, because you develop tolerance and you can certainly, as we see in this country, develop addiction.
When you were in office working under President Obama fighting drugs, what was the biggest obstacle? Because I mean, one of the things that we always talk about here in Washington is the bureaucracy oftentimes gets in the way of trying to implement really good programs and really good ideas. Did you find at all that the bureaucracy of the federal government made it difficult for you to achieve some of the things you would have liked to?
Well, the interesting part is that, you know, the office was created in 1988. It was meant to bring together all of the different cabinet offices, because everyone has a piece of the drug problem: Health and Human Services, Justice, the Pentagon, the VA, etc. And so you're getting them all to kind of join in, and these are all within their own budgets. So if you can get them to sit down and cooperate and work through a policy and a strategy that they all agree on, then they're much more willing to move forward and to spend their own time and their own resources to make that work. I think the biggest frustration I had was with the Department of Education. I really wanted them to engage more in the development and pushing some quality prevention programs within the schools, but I wasn't successful doing that.
Why? Why wouldn't they want to do that? Or why couldn't they do that?
So I think the concentration then at the time in the Department of Education was very much on the school violence issues. The Secretary, Arnie Duncan, a great person to work with, but coming from Chicago, the school violence issues were very much front and center. And when you think about prevention programs, these are long-term strategies, and at the end of a year or 2 years or 5 years, you can't really go back and say, gee, this made a tremendous difference. This might take 10 and 15 and even 20 years. And
regrettably, sometimes the violence is married to the drug issue as well, so it's very complicated. Sir, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks. Thank you.
Compounding the drug problem here in the United States is the explosion in the overuse of legal prescription drugs and the spread of synthetic opiates such as fentanyl. Fentanyl, originally manufactured to treat chronic pain, can cause severe respiratory distress and even death when combined with other substances. A small amount can kill. Fentanyl has been banned in many countries, but is smuggled all over the world, including the United States. As Plugged In's Larry Lazo reports, fentanyl is just one of the many new synthetic drugs that has added another deadly layer to the worldwide drug epidemic.
In some major cities and rural areas around the world, a vicious cycle of addiction is playing out.
People enter these binges, they're not going anywhere, right? It is all about the next fix.
It's that next heroin fix that keeps Sarah coming back for more.
I don't know, something always calls me back here. My mind just tells me to come back here. I don't want to, and I cry a lot, and you know, it's a lot of guilt. That's the other thing. Like, you feel guilty, and then you can't deal with the guilt, so then you get high to deal with the guilt.
Sarah isn't alone. The World Health Organization says an estimated 27 million people suffered from opioid use disorders in 2016, most of them addicted to heroin and prescription drugs. And more than 70,000 people in the United States died of an opioid overdose in 2017.
The epidemic has resulted in a new generation of people suffering from the disease of addiction.
For many drug addicts, getting their fix is as easy as buying it on the street. But prescription drug abuse has resulted in a different type of epidemic, with at times a different kind of supplier. All it takes is a doctor to illegally prescribe an opioid.
If so-called medical professionals behave like drug dealers, the Department of Justice is going to treat them like drug dealers.
In April, 53 medical professionals in 7 U.S. states were charged with illegally prescribing opioids and other dangerous drugs. In all, 350,000 unlawful prescriptions totaling 32 million pills were allegedly handed out by those charged.
This takedown is the largest of its kind against DEA-registered prescribers.
These opioids often end up on the black market for sale. And then there's fentanyl, the deadliest of all opioids. On the left, you have a lethal dose of heroin, about 30 milligrams. Compare that to the bottle on the right, a 3 milligram dose of fentanyl, enough to kill an average-sized adult male. Most of the illegal fentanyl responsible for this epidemic is said to come from China. U.S. President Donald Trump pressed Chinese President Xi Jinping to crack down on the shipments by labeling fentanyl and its derivatives as a controlled substance. The Chinese have started to comply, but criminal operations in other countries are moving in to fill the void.
My job, this country is paying me to be a DEA agent and arrest people. But I'm saying that the most important thing that we can be doing right now is prevention efforts and talking to younger kids so they understand the dangers of this crisis.
Larry Lazo, VOA News, Washington.
When it comes to winning the global war on drugs, whether through enforcement, prevention, or treatment, international efforts can vary greatly from one country to the next. In some countries, it includes rehabilitative treatment. In other countries, the penalty can be execution for both sellers and even users. Plugged In's Brian Allen has more.
Marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamines. Americans' voracious appetite for illegal drugs made neighboring Mexico one of the world's biggest battlegrounds for the war on drugs. But after years of fighting and tens of thousands dead, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador declared that the war is over, at least in his country.
Se terminó. The extermination war against so-called organized crime is over. No more raids, attacks, or massacres are allowed. The disappearance of people is not allowed.
These drugs have also started to flow from Latin America across the Pacific Ocean to satisfy the increasing demand in Australia and New Zealand. That has made small islands in the South Pacific the new front line in this war. In the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte campaigned on a promise to kill tens of thousands of criminals, urging citizens to kill drug addicts.
Kidnappers. The drug pushers, kidnappers, robbers, go find them and arrest them. If they fight back with violent resistance, kill them all.
In 2018, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes says it has discovered nearly 5 million new users of prescription opioids in West Africa in just 1 year, and that number is rising. While many countries continue to jail low-level drug dealers, some Latin American countries like Argentina and Colombia have decriminalized some drugs for personal use. And in 2017, Uruguay became the world's first country to legalize marijuana. Canada was the second country to do so last year. 11 states in the U.S. have legalized marijuana as well. Brian Allen, VOA News, Washington.
But is raising awareness enough to control the deadly spread of opiates in the United States and around the world? My next guest has some insight into the opiate problem and where it is coming from. Ben Westhoff is an award-winning investigative journalist and former music editor. He is also a best-selling author who has written 4 books. His latest is Fentanyl Is, How Rogue Chemists Are Creating the Deadliest Wave of the Opioid Epidemic. He joins us on Skype from St. Louis, Missouri. Welcome to Plugged In.
Thank you, Greta.
You have been quoted as saying that fentanyl is a game changer. What do you mean by that?
Well, fentanyl is the drug that nobody wants in a lot of ways, and it's cut into not just heroin, but cocaine, meth, prescription pills. That's how Prince died. And so when people don't even realize they're taking this ultra-powerful drug, it's much easier to die.
It is manufactured, obviously, overseas, comes in through the U.S. borders, but is fentanyl also created in labs here in the United States?
There is medical fentanyl made here, but that's not really what's driving the problem. It's almost all the illicit fentanyl that's manufactured in China.
And I suppose because so little, it's about 100 times more potent than, for instance, heroin or morphine, that it's easier to traffic in it. You don't need, it's easier to traffic in smaller amounts, which have greater impact.
Yeah, exactly. And so much of it is actually sent through the U.S. mail. It's sent from China, bought on the dark web or even the clear web, and sent through the mail, including UPS, FedEx, and sometimes it comes on cargo ships. And it's such a tiny amount that it's very easy to smuggle.
And what is the purpose of adding it to something like cocaine? Is to give it a different high? I mean, why are these other drugs? You may think you're buying just heroin, you may think you're buying cocaine, but you may be getting a deadly amount of fentanyl.
Well, fentanyl is just so much cheaper. These other drugs are natural plants like heroin, cocaine, and it takes a lot of money and time and space to grow them. Whereas fentanyl can be made synthetically in a lab. It's so much cheaper, and therefore drug dealers are padding their profits.
My former guest didn't like the term war on drugs, and I guess, you know, since the war on drugs at least doesn't, in my mind, seem to be one, I can understand his viewpoint. But what are we winning the war on drugs? Are we grossly losing this war?
I think, unfortunately, we are losing. And when you look at the murder of Pablo Escobar a ways back, the capture of El Chapo recently, these have not stopped drugs from coming from places like Colombia and Mexico. And President Trump has talked a lot about holding China to task for these drugs. And there's certainly a lot to be said for that. But ultimately, if China is stopped from being allowed to bring these drugs over here, the trade could shift to places like India.
Well, China's denying that they're responsible. In fact, the top drug enforcement officer in China just said that in a press conference the other day that you know, China was not responsible. So they say they're not guilty, that they're not the ones. But another sort of interesting statistic, the National Institute on Drug Abuse says fentanyl was behind 30,000 of the 72,000 overdose deaths in the U.S. last year. It's incredible.
Yeah, that is. It's very sad, tragic, but it is true that these drugs, fentanyl and its analogs, are coming out of China. In fact, I went undercover pretending to be a drug dealer to some of these Chinese labs, and I expected to find this sort of underground facility guarded by guys with AK-47s, but it was all very above board. These looked like typical chemical companies with rows of salespeople hawking these chemical products, fentanyl precursors, on the internet. And so I was very shocked to see it.
Do you find any of the fentanyl going to other areas of the world, like, for instance, Africa? Are you seeing sort of a trade route to fentanyl to Africa?
Africa and the Middle East have a big problem with the opioid tramadol, which is not as potent as fentanyl, but still a big problem. Right now, most of fentanyl's damage is in the U.S. and Canada, where we're in the third wave of the opioid crisis. The first was the pills, then heroin, and now fentanyl.
If you had a magic wand, I mean, what's your idea? What's the strategy to try to solve this crisis?
I agree with your previous guest that the war on drugs is not getting us anywhere, and that it's about realizing that kids are always going to take drugs. People are always going to take drugs, and we have to try to make it as safe as possible. So there's a strategy called harm reduction, and it includes things like fentanyl testing strips. And these strips are kind of like a pregnancy test. You make a solution of your drugs, dip them in there, and then one stripe will show there's no fentanyl, two stripes there is fentanyl. And studies have shown that when users realize fentanyl is in their heroin or their cocaine, they will be much less likely to use it in an overdose.
Are they looking for fentanyl, or are they looking for cocaine and heroin without fentanyl? Is anyone looking for just fentanyl?
Sadly, some people are looking for that too. There are longtime addicted users to heroin who can't get high anymore. They can only get past their withdrawal symptoms. But fentanyl is so much more powerful that they can actually get high again.
How about big business? How much is this worth to the people who are trafficking this? Any way to quantify that?
It's not, but some of my more disturbing findings in my book was that the Chinese government is certainly profiting off this trafficking, because in an effort to increase exports to countries like the US, China actually offers tax rebates for the export and production of fentanyl, as well as a lot of the different analogs. So that was something I was pretty shocked to realize.
All right. Well, your book is now the treatise on this, so I'm curious what it was that provoked you to write this book. It's an important book, but why this one?
I used to be a music editor, and I was covering the industry of electronic dance music and raves, and wondering why at every single rave someone died, all of these big raves. And so the deaths were attributed to ecstasy, to MDMA, but I didn't realize that was a dangerous drug. What I found out was that all of the ecstasy was being adulterated with these brand new drugs from China. And that sent me down a rabbit hole and eventually brought me to fentanyl, which is the deadliest of all of them.
Is fentanyl easy to make? If you're a chemist with a reasonable amount of education, you can make it, and are everything you need readily available?
It's not so easy, and that's the reason that the Mexican cartels don't make it themselves. They rely entirely on the precursors from China. And so when you think about meth production, people use Sudafed. The cooks would buy all the packs of Sudafed and use that to make meth. It's the same with fentanyl. You need the precursors, and so the Mexican cartels rely almost entirely on China for these precursors.
And it appears that the president of Mexico has declared he's given up on the war on drugs.
Well, it's hard from a geopolitical standpoint for me to comment on whether that might be effective. All I know is that in the US, we really need to control our demand and help people who are addicted and help spread awareness about the dangers of these drugs.
Yeah, it's just horrible. I mean, people are dying, and it's not just the person who takes it and dies, but the family member who's got a broken heart. It's just so widespread. It's touching so many American families in so many ways. It's just such a crisis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. Ben Westhoff, the author of the book Fentanyl, Inc.
Thanks so much, Greta.
And before we go, some closing thoughts on a story we have been monitoring since 2017, the brutal massacre of ethnic Muslims in Myanmar. It has been 2 years since Myanmar's military slaughtered hundreds of Rohingyas, thousands of them, and since more than 700,000 fled for their lives to neighboring Bangladesh to escape the Myanmar military's so-called clearance operation. The international community has condemned the military torching of entire villages, the rape of women and girls, and of course the massacre. It's genocide. 2 years later, the plight of the Rohingya continues. Hope is hard to come by as Rohingya families scrabble for survival. The world seems to have forgotten them. But we at Plugged In, we have not forgotten them. We will continue to press Myanmar's leaders for answers, and we'll continue to remind our viewers that we live in a global village, and that how we treat the least among us is what will define us for future generations. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta, and follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.